The snow didn't fall so much as drift, like ash from a fire long spent. By the time John Carver reached the tree line, his gloves were stiff with frost, his breath smoking in the quiet. He wasn't a man who minded the cold. Kept folks honest. Kept grief frozen where it belonged. The sled behind him creaked as the mule dragged it over a narrow trail, the wooden boards rattling beneath the wrapped body. Pine trunks lined either side of the path like sentinels, tall, solemn, and unmoved by the burden John had hauled through the morning gloom. He hadn't asked for a name. The man who'd come to his cabin before dawn hadn't offered one. Just silver and a request: dig a grave and put the girl in it. Found her in the ravine, the man had said, as if she were no more than a broken wagon wheel. John had done this before, burials for strangers, folks who died with no one to mourn them. The work was quiet, and quiet was something he could live with. But something about this morning made his skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the man wouldn't meet his eye. Or maybe it was the snow, how it blanketed everything like it meant to hide more than just the dead. He found the spot near a crooked birch, its trunk gnarled like an old woman's knuckles. The earth beneath was hard, but he'd brought tools sharp enough to bite through frost. He set to work, shoveling steadily, his breath loud in his ears. Every scrape of the blade echoed between the trees. By the time the pit was wide enough, his shoulders ached and his hands stung with cold. He turned to the sled, pulled back the blanket. She was young. Younger than his Anna had been when she passed. Dark hair spilled over her shoulders, matted with ice. Her skin had the look of porcelain left out too long, faintly blue, almost luminous. Lips parted slightly. No bruising, no blood. Just stillness. John exhaled slow. He reached for her shoulders and then stopped. There was something wrong. The silence wasn't right. He leaned down, frowning, and placed a gloved hand near her nose. A whisper of air touched his fingertips. He blinked. Then again. It was shallow but there. Alive. He pulled back, stumbled, heart pounding in his throat. For a long moment he knelt there in the snow, staring like a man seeing a ghost. "Lord above," he murmured. He looked again. Her chest moved, barely, but it moved. He stood quickly, shaking the snow from his coat. He didn't think. Didn't question. He just acted. Lifted her gently, arms cradling her limp form. She was lighter than expected. Bones, cold skin, nothing else. The trail back home seemed longer. Trees closed in tighter. But he didn't stop. When the mule faltered, he led her by rope. When the wind howled, he leaned forward, shielding the girl with his coat. The cabin sat alone on a rise, its chimney thin with smoke. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepping into the scent of pine sap, old bread, and faint lavender from a dried bundle hanging near the hearth. He laid her on the cot near the fire, peeled the ice-damp blanket from her, and wrapped her in the thickest wool he owned. For a while, he sat by the fire with his back against the wall, listening to her shallow breathing. Snow hissed against the windowpane. His boots steamed as they dried near the hearth. He studied her face. The curve of her cheek. The lashes that trembled just faintly when the fire popped. She looked like Anna. Not just a resemblance. She looked like Anna. The same sharp chin. The same half-solemn brow. But younger. Barely 20 if that. His jaw tightened. He hadn't seen his wife's face in nearly 7 years, and yet here it was, staring at him from a body found in the snow. He reached for the small flask beneath the mantel, uncorked it, and took a slow drink. It burned going down but steadied his hands. "Who are you?" he muttered. She stirred. He blinked. Her eyes fluttered open, not wide, not in panic. Just enough for him to catch their color. Hazel, like moss under frozen water. She stared past him, lips dry and cracked. "Water?" he said gently, grabbing a tin cup from the shelf. He held it to her mouth, tipped it slowly. She drank. Not much, but enough. She tried to speak. "Don't," he said. "Just rest." Her fingers curled weakly at the edge of the blanket. A tremor moved through her limbs. Not from cold, fear. He pulled another quilt over her and added wood to the fire. The warmth deepened, curling against the walls. Still she shivered. She spoke a single word before sleep took her again. A name. Clara. John sat back slowly. That name didn't mean anything to him. But the way she'd said it, like a prayer. Or a memory. At dawn she slept. Her face calmer now. His tools still sat by the door, caked in half-frozen dirt. John cleaned them absently, eyes unfocused. The next day the sheriff came. Rode up just as John was feeding the mule. "Morning, Carver," Sheriff Hall called, dismounting with a grunt. John nodded. "Mornin', Marshal." Hall wiped snow from his beard. You hear anything about a girl found out near Bracken's ravine? Word is she was traveling with a preacher's wagon. Disappeared 2 days back. Stranger rode into town claiming he saw wolves tear up the camp, but the preacher's body was half burned. Girl wasn't there. John's eyes didn't flinch. Can't say I have. You see anything strange? No more than usual. Hall looked past him toward the cabin where smoke rose from the chimney. You live alone still? I do. The silence stretched. Finally Hall tipped his hat. Well, if you hear anything, come find me. There's talk she ran. Might have seen something she wasn't meant to. John nodded. I'll let you know. When the sheriff left, John stepped inside. Snow, Clara, lay still, but her breathing was stronger now. Her lips less pale. Later that night, she bolted awake. She didn't scream, but her eyes were wide, darting. He crouched beside the cot. It's all right. You're safe. She stared at him. Then at the room. Her hands clenched into fists. He didn't speak. Just waited. Her voice came as a whisper. Where am I? My cabin. I found you half dead. She closed her eyes, trembling. I remember trees. A cart. Rope. Her fingers went to her wrist, brushing against the raw skin. John swallowed. You said a name. Claire. Is that yours? She nodded slowly. Then opened her eyes again. Why did you save me? He hesitated. Because I couldn't bury you. Her lips pressed together as if that answer wasn't enough, or maybe it was too much. He added more wood to the fire and turned toward the door. Rest now. But before he stepped out, her voice followed. They tried to bury me. He froze. Clara's eyes were wide again. This time not with fear. With certainty. In the snow. Alive. John didn't respond. He simply closed the door behind him, heart thudding, the wind biting deeper than before. By morning, the wind had died, leaving behind a silence so thick it pressed against the cabin walls. The stove cracked faintly, heat blooming across the floorboards, but it did little to chase away the ghosts in John's head. He sat by the window, one leg propped up on a wooden stool, watching the frost creep along the glass like a slow-moving spider. Clara was still asleep. She hadn't stirred much during the night. Just turned once, murmured something about fire, then gone still again. But now the color was beginning to return to her face. Her fingers no longer curled in defense. She looked more like someone dreaming than someone fleeing death. He didn't know what to make of it. Of her. Of the name. Claire. He'd never heard it spoken with such weariness, like it was borrowed or unwanted. And when she looked at him, there was something behind her eyes that didn't quite belong to a girl her age. Something older. More broken. John shifted in his chair, leaned forward, and tossed another log into the stove. Sparks burst up like fireflies. He'd built this place with his own hands after Anna passed. Chose the hill for the wind. Chose the trees for the quiet. The inside was clean, ordered, nothing for the eye to linger on too long. There were no portraits, no wedding pictures. Only a pressed flower behind glass. A single red bloom gone brown, mounted on the mantel. Anna's. He turned from it now. Behind him the girl stirred. Where am I? She asked, voice rough as gravel. He stood slowly. Safe. That's all you need to know for now. Her brow furrowed as she tried to sit up. Her arms trembled with the effort. You the one who pulled me out? I was hired to bury you. She blinked. What? He crossed the room, knelt by the cot. I don't know who wanted you gone, but someone rode out, paid me in silver, said there was a girl found dead in a ravine. I've dug graves for less. But when I saw your face... He didn't finish. Her fingers twitched beneath the wool blanket. You didn't know me? No. Then why did you stop? His answer came slow. You looked like my wife. At least the way she used to look. Before the sickness. Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her breath caught. She's dead. 7 years now. She nodded faintly, eyes scanning the rafters. I remember cold. And voices. A prayer maybe. Then, nothing. Just dark. He stood uneasy. You need rest. There's a stew on the fire. Eat when you're ready. But she sat up straighter. I remember rope. Around my wrists. She lifted her arms. The marks were faint but real. I saw that too. You think I'm lying? I think you nearly died. That tends to twist the mind. She frowned. You don't believe me. I didn't say that. He paused. I just don't know what to believe yet. Clara's eyes dropped to the floor. Her voice came softer. They said I had to repent. That I'd been touched by the devil. But I never did anything wrong. Who said that? She didn't answer. just stared at the flames. He didn't press her. Instead, he moved toward the table, poured a bowl of stew and brought it to her. She took it with shaking hands and began to eat slowly. The silence stretched, broken only by the quiet clink of spoon against tin. Outside, a hawk cried in the distance. "Do you live here alone?" she asked finally. "I do." "No family?" "Not anymore." "And you bury strangers for money?" He met her gaze. "I used to run cattle. But the winters got harder. Work dried up. Sometimes I fix fences, mend roofs. And sometimes I bury the dead." "You're good at it?" "I've had practice." She looked away again, the lines in her forehead deepening. "Do you think I should have died?" He hesitated. "No." "Why not?" "Because you're still breathing." She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed a little. That night the wind picked up again. Clara sat wrapped in a quilt, staring at the wood stove while John smoked by the door. She didn't speak much. Just watched the flames dance. "You never told me your name," she said quietly. "John Carver." "You don't talk much, John Carver." "I talk when I have something worth saying." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer, then shifted to the window. "They'll come looking." "For you?" She nodded. "You remember who they are?" "No. But I know what it felt like." He exhaled smoke slowly. "You're safe here. For now. But not forever." He didn't argue. He wasn't one for promises he couldn't keep. Later, she wandered into the back room and stopped short. There were things on the shelves, a dress hung on a nail, dried herbs in bunches, a pair of boots still dusted in old trail mud. She ran her fingers over the fabric of the dress. "She was small," Clara murmured. "Smaller than you," John agreed from behind her. "Why keep her things?" "I couldn't throw them out." She turned to face him. "You bury strangers. But you couldn't bury her, not really?" He said nothing. That night Clara dreamed. He heard her cries through the wall. Not screams, just soft whimpers, like someone trapped in a memory too heavy to shake. He stood in the doorway, unsure if waking her would help. When morning came, she didn't mention it. Instead, she found a broom, started sweeping the cabin floor. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I want to." She moved slowly but with purpose, as if cleaning might give her mind something else to hold on to. That afternoon she asked to go outside. He helped her wrap up. The snow was crusted now, thick and stubborn. They walked a few steps before she had to stop. She leaned against the fence, looking out across the white field. "I dreamed I was underground," she whispered. "I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. And when I opened my eyes, dirt was falling on my face." John stayed beside her. He didn't touch her. Just let her speak. "I think they buried me alive." He stared at the trees. "Then whoever did it should be hunted." She turned to him. "Would you do it?" His jaw tightened. "If I knew who they were." She studied him then, as if weighing what kind of man he truly was. "You didn't ask many questions before saving me." "No." "Why not?" "Because sometimes questions just get in the way of what needs doing." She didn't speak after that. Just nodded, lips pressed into a firm line, eyes narrowing against the wind. That night he caught her standing in front of the mirror. She wore Anna's shawl, dark blue wool with stitched roses along the edge. She held it tight around her shoulders, turning from side to side. "You sure she wouldn't mind?" Clara asked without looking at him. "She's not the type to haunt over something like that." Clara gave the faintest smile. "You look like her," he said. "I'm not her." "I know." She stepped closer, the firelight warming her cheeks. "But I don't know who I am either." By the time the snow began to soften beneath the morning sun, John had fixed the barn's broken hinge and Clara had managed to boil coffee without burning the kettle. The rhythm of days had taken shape, quiet but not cold, shared but not yet spoken aloud. She still woke with a start some nights, and he still paused before saying her name, as if it were too fragile to rest fully on his tongue. But she swept the floor without being asked, and he cut her portion of firewood smaller so her hands wouldn't strain. It was a kind of peace, temporary and thin as ice, but peace nonetheless. Then word came from town. A rider passed just before dusk, flicking snow off his coat as he dropped a parcel at John's gate, a saddle he'd ordered 3 weeks back and nearly forgotten. Along with it came news. Sheriff Hall was calling a meeting at the saloon. A stranger had turned up at the Bracken Trail camp, muttering about buried women and a wagon left burning. No names were given. No suspects named. But Clara's hand shook when she read the sheriff's flyer tucked between the leather straps of the package. Her likeness was rough, charcoal scratches on yellowed paper, but her eyes were unmistakable. "Wild. Haunted." The kind of gaze a man didn't forget. John watched her lips press into a flat line. "I should go," he said. She didn't meet his gaze. "You'll be asked questions." "I know. You're a bad liar." "I know that too." She folded the flyer carefully and slid it under the stove. When John rode into town the next morning, the wind had teeth again. Smoke curled out of chimneys like the breath of sleeping giants. Townsfolk had gathered in clusters, some around the saloon, others outside the store. John dismounted and tied his horse loosely, as if he wasn't planning to stay long. Inside the saloon, laughter drifted over the smell of burnt whiskey and old cigars. He stepped through the doors and felt a half-dozen eyes track him. The place hadn't changed. Same warped piano in the corner, same mirror streaked with age. The same voices pretending not to know how close they were to rot. At the back table, 3 men sat playing cards. One was the sheriff. The others were unfamiliar, until the man with the scar across his chin lifted his head. Silas Keene. John knew that name like a wound. A bounty hunter without a badge but plenty of kills. He used to track rustlers across the New Mexico border. Once hung a man from his own barn rafter just to make a point. Now he sat here, sipping rotgut, dealing cards with the calm of a vulture full from yesterday's kill. John approached slow. Hall looked up first. "Carver," he said. "Didn't expect to see you." John nodded once. "Heard there was news. We got a fire survivor. Says a girl got dragged off by some preacher's men. They were looking to cleanse her. Wagon burned. No girl found." John kept his face even. "What's that got to do with me?" Silas answered before Hall could. "Word is she's alive. Someone pulled her out. Might be hiding her. Figure if we find the man dumb enough to play hero, we'll find the girl too." John met his eyes. "And you think that's me?" Silas smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. "No. But I think you know where to look." John didn't flinch. "I know how to dig graves. That's all." Silas leaned back in his chair, lifting a boot onto the bench. "Funny thing about girls who get buried and come back. They don't stay quiet for long." The table went still. Hall cleared his throat. "Let's not jump at shadows. We don't even know if the story's true." Silas reached into his coat, pulled out a folded sheet. Slapped it on the table. John didn't need to look. He already knew what was on it. "A bounty flyer," Silas said, voice casual. "Says she's worth 100 in silver. More if brought back breathing." John raised an eyebrow. "To who?" Silas's smile thinned. "Folks who think she saw too much. That ain't law. That's coin. And coin talks louder." John studied him a moment longer. Then turned to the sheriff. "You ought to know better than to let men like him run wild." Hall looked tired. "I don't have the men. And he's not breaking any laws, yet." John tipped his hat. "Then I'll be going." He turned and walked out without looking back. Outside, the snow had begun again. Gentle flakes at first, but steady. He rode hard, cutting cross-country through the pines, avoiding the main trail. The air burned his lungs. The trees passed like ghosts. He didn't stop until his boots hit the porch. Clara was waiting, rifle in her lap, eyes sharp. "They saw it," she said. He nodded. "They did. Do they know?" He shook his head. "Not yet. But one man's sniffing close." "Who?" "Keene. The kind who kills first, asks never." Clara looked down at the rifle, then back at him. "I won't be taken. I won't let you." She stood, eyes brimming but jaw tight. "I don't want to run anymore." "Then we don't run." That night they didn't speak much. Just sat by the fire, weapons nearby, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come. In the dark, John remembered Anna's voice, soft, patient, always singing as she cooked. Clara was nothing like her. And yet something in the way she sat, chin high, eyes forward, made his chest ache with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe. At dawn, he caught Clara standing by the barn, staring at the tree line. She didn't turn when she spoke. "They called it a sanctuary. The place they took me. Said it was God's will. That I needed purging." John said nothing. Let her speak on her own terms. "I believed them at first. I wanted to be good. I scrubbed floors until my hands bled. I prayed until my knees cracked. But it was never enough." She looked back at him. "Then one night I spoke back. That was it. They dragged me out. Said they'd bury my sins in the ground." John's throat tightened. "You didn't deserve that. No one does." She turned away again, brushing her sleeve against her cheek. "I remember one of them," she whispered. His belt had a brass cross carved into the buckle. He watched while they did it. Smiled like he was doing the Lord's work. John's jaw flexed. If I ever see him. You won't. He's dead. I saw the fire take him. That's how I got free. Her voice went quiet. They thought I died in the smoke. But I crawled out. Hands raw. Eyes full of ash. I ran until I couldn't. She paused. That's when I collapsed. That's when they must have found me. John stepped closer. You don't have to carry all that alone. She looked at him. You think I'm broken? No. I think you're burning. He reached out, touched her shoulder gently. But fire can cleanse too. She nodded, a tremble in her breath. They stood there a while longer. The snow fell quietly around them. Inside, the fire crackled, unaware of what might come next. And beyond the ridge, hoofbeats stirred. The sky was ink black, the kind that presses down on a man's shoulders and makes the stars seem too far to matter. The fire had gone low in the stove. John sat in the dark beside the window, boots on, rifle across his lap. He hadn't slept. Clara hadn't either. She lay on the cot fully dressed, her coat folded beside her, revolver within reach. Neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't tense. It was the kind of silence shared by people who know something's coming but aren't ready to say it aloud. At some point during the night, the wind shifted. John stood, moved to the door, cracked it open. Snow fell in ribbons, light but steady. The trees swayed just enough to whisper. Then from the ridge beyond the barn came the first sound, hooves. Clara was already beside him before he could turn. It's them? He didn't ask how she knew. 3 riders came down slow, silhouettes against the dim outline of the trees. Their shapes blurred by snow, their posture too easy for this hour. John narrowed his eyes. One of them peeled off from the others, rode ahead, and dismounted just beyond the barn. He didn't knock. John opened the door before the stranger reached the porch. It was Silas. His hat was crusted with ice. His gloves were cracked leather, stiff with blood at the knuckles. He smiled like a man who'd never had to chase what he wanted. "Morning," he said. "Didn't want to startle you." "You did anyway," John replied. Silas nodded toward the barn. "Nice place. Shame if someone burned it." John stepped out, blocking the doorway. "You're not welcome here." That's a mighty big statement for a man harboring a fugitive. John didn't answer. Silas cocked his head. "You know what she is, don't you? What she saw. That girl's a problem. To the wrong people. Folks are willing to pay for quiet. She's not yours to claim." Silas chuckled. "Ain't about claiming. It's about closing doors before they swing too wide." Behind John, Clara's voice rang out, hard and clear. "If you want me, you'll have to try." Silas grinned. "There she is." Clara stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand. Eyes like flint. "You dragged me from a chapel. Watched while they tied me down. You knew what they were." He gave a little shrug. "What I knew don't matter now. What matters is I got a price on your head and 3 men behind me with cold hands and fast draws." John's voice was quiet. "Then you best pray one of them's faster than me." Silas's grin vanished. His hand twitched toward his belt. John moved first. The rifle roared once, echoing off the trees. Silas staggered back, dropped to one knee, blood blooming across his coat. He cursed, fumbled for his pistol. From the ridge, a second shot cracked. A round buried itself into the porch post beside John's head. Clara ducked and fired back. John moved off the porch and into the snow, rolling behind the water trough. The cold bit into his back, but he stayed low and fired again. One of the riders screamed, then silence. A third shape darted toward the barn. Clara caught him in her sights and pulled the trigger. He dropped face first, rifle clattering. Silas tried crawling toward his horse. John stepped out, rifle raised. "Don't," John warned. The bounty hunter froze. His breath came in ragged plumes. "You don't want to kill me, Carver? I'm just the messenger. I already read the message. You think they'll stop? There's more of us. More coin. This ain't the end." "No," John said. "But it's where you stop talking." The final shot echoed through the trees, sharp and final. When the smoke cleared, the snow was stained in 3 places. John exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. Clara stood on the porch, eyes wide, shoulders trembling, not from fear but from something older. Older than the frost. Older than pain. She stepped down, boots sinking into the blood-dappled snow. She stared at Silas's body, lips pressed tight. "I never thought I'd see him fall." "You shouldn't have had to see him at all," John said. She knelt slowly, reached down, and unbuckled Silas's belt. A brass cross glinted in the moonlight. Clara stared at it for a long moment, then tossed it into the fire barrel near the porch. The flames hissed. The metal clanged once against the iron rim, then disappeared into the coals. John reached for her arm. "You all right?" She looked at him. "No." "Good," he said softly. "Only fools would be." They spent the rest of the night burying the bodies behind the barn. No prayers. Just cold hands and hard shovels. When the last stone was laid, dawn broke, thin and gray across the hills. Inside, Clara sat by the stove, legs tucked beneath her, face streaked with soot and something deeper. "I remember now," she said. "John didn't ask. He waited. The man who paid you to bury me. He wasn't just passing through. He was one of them. Quiet. Always watching. He slipped something in my tea the night before. I thought I was just tired. You weren't." She shook her head. "I woke up in the cart. Couldn't move. They thought I was dead. Dumped me in the snow like garbage. You clawed out." Her voice cracked. "Barely. But you did." They sat in the quiet a while longer. The fire popped. Outside the wind had died down. Then Clara spoke again. "Do you believe in signs?" "Like what?" "Like someone putting the wrong man in the right place. Like waking up to the face of someone who still believes in kindness." John didn't answer right away. Then, "I believe in second chances. Even if they come too late." She looked at him. This one didn't. They didn't speak for the rest of the morning. Didn't need to. Outside the world was thawing slowly. And this time, they wouldn't be buried. The thaw came slow that year, as if the land itself wasn't quite ready to forgive what had happened beneath its skin. Snow melted into slush, then ice water, then disappeared into the soil with a silence that felt too much like grief. John stood near the edge of the meadow, boots sinking into the soft earth, his hands calloused around the handle of a shovel that no longer served the same purpose it once had. This time, the hole he was digging wasn't for death. It was for something else entirely. Clara watched from a distance, seated on the porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, the shawl still draped over her shoulders. She hadn't worn anything else of Anna's since that night. But she hadn't put the shawl away either. It lived between them now, soft as memory, solid as truth. A tether that connected what had been lost to what had been found. John struck the ground one last time, then stepped back to look at the small granite stone he'd placed at the head of the plot. It bore no dates. Only a name, etched in his own hand. Anna Carver. 4 years, her grave had gone unmarked, hidden behind the cabin near the birch grove. He hadn't wanted words then. Couldn't bear to see her name set in something permanent. But Clara had said something weeks ago while tending the hearth. Something simple and sharp. If love was real, then it deserves a name. And he'd heard her. For once fully. He stood beside the marker now, heart hollow and full in the same breath. When he turned, Clara was walking toward him, boots trailing through the wet grass. "You done?" she asked softly. He nodded. She'd have liked it. He didn't answer. Just looked at her. She stood straighter these days. Still carried scars on her wrists, but her shoulders no longer hunched. Her eyes had settled, still watchful but no longer wild. Some nights she still woke gasping, and some mornings she still stood too long staring at the trees. But she didn't flinch when the wind moved the shutters, and she didn't check the locks 3 times before sleep. She had begun to belong here. So had he. They walked back to the cabin together, the silence easy now. Inside, she stirred coffee while he polished the stock of his old Winchester. Neither spoke of the blood that had been spilled. Neither spoke of Silas or the other men who wouldn't be missed. The earth had taken them, and the land, like always, kept its secrets. Clara placed a mug in front of him, then sat. "I had another name once," she said. He looked up. "They called me Clara Langston after the man who brought me into the church. Said he saved me. Gave me a family. But he never did. He just wanted to own something that prayed." John's jaw tightened, but he let her go on. "I'm not her anymore." He nodded slowly. "What name do you want?" She looked toward the window where the sun had started slipping low behind the ridge. Its light struck the frost still clinging to the edge of the porch roof, making it shimmer like glass. "I don't want a name given to me by pain," she said. "Or by a man who tried to make me disappear." She turned back to him, eyes steady. "I want yours. If you'll give it." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. John reached across the table, calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. "Clara Carver," he said aloud, letting the name settle into the room. "Fit. Not as a replacement for Anna. Not as a second act. But as something entirely new. Something earned." They didn't rush into marriage. There was no preacher, no town hall. No ring carved of gold. Just a quiet agreement between 2 people who had clawed their way out of different kinds of graves. The townsfolk noticed, of course. whispered at the mercantile. Watched when Clara walked in beside John, her back straight, her head high. A few recognized her from the poster long since torn from the saloon wall. No one asked questions. Not out loud. John's rifle, always slung across his back, did most of the talking. One spring morning, Sheriff Hall rode up the ridge with a letter from a northern judge. Official pardon. Her name had been cleared, the preacher's crimes made public by a traveler who'd found the wreckage. Clara read the paper once, then tossed it into the stove. "I don't need proof," she said. "I survived. That's all the record I need." John didn't argue. Instead, they focused on planting. New seeds. A new fence. A small barn built by their hands and no one else's. Every nail driven into the wood felt like a promise. Every tool passed between them felt like a vow. Clara painted the inside walls of the cabin white, then stenciled wild roses around the windowsills. John carved her name into the porch rail one afternoon, just below the spot where Anna's pressed flowers still hung. He didn't move it. He just let the two names live beside each other, quiet as breath. Sometimes at night Clara would hum soft, tuneless melodies that filled the space between dreams. He never asked what the songs meant. He just listened. And one morning, long after the last frost had melted and the creek had found its voice again, they walked out to the ridge overlooking the valley. Below them, the world shimmered with green. "I thought I was dead," she whispered. "Not just in the snow. But before that. I was disappearing piece by piece. Every time I was told to be quiet. Every time I obeyed. I thought if I was small enough, they'd let me live." John said nothing. Just took her hand. "But you didn't ask me to be small," she continued. "You never asked me to be quiet. You deserve better," he said. "I got it," she replied. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, wind tugging gently at their clothes. Behind them, the cabin stood with smoke curling from its chimney and a door that no longer creaked when opened. The grave behind it had a name now, and the space around it had begun to bloom with wildflowers. Sometimes life doesn't return the way you expect. It doesn't arrive in sunlight or celebration. Sometimes it begins in a snowstorm in a stranger's arms, with a shovel meant for goodbye. Sometimes a grave is the first step toward something worth living for. And if you listen close, quiet enough to catch the truth, you'll hear it. In the name spoken gently across a table. In the breath shared beside a stove. In a name carved not for the dead, but for the beginning. He met her gaze. "Maybe that's something we both get to figure out." The wind howled against the cabin again. Snow rattled the shutters. Inside, the room held stillness, not empty but waiting. And this time neither of them felt quite so alone. The barn door creaked open beneath Jedediah Holt's calloused hand, slow as a man waking from an old dream. Morning light slipped in sideways, cold and uninvited, painting long slats across the packed dirt floor. The cows were already stirring, low murmurs from their pens, but something in the air stilled him. A scent that didn't belong. Blood, faint but sharp. Not iron from tools, not the rust of age. Human. He stepped forward, boots whispering against the straw. The light widened its reach as he slid the lantern glass open and lifted the flame. That's when he saw her. She lay curled like a question left too long unanswered. Tattered skirts, one slipper gone. Blood soaked through the hem of her white dress, if it had ever been white to begin with. Now it was mud and memory and ruin. Her hair, dark, tangled, stuck to her face like wet silk. One arm cradled her ribs, the other drawn over her chest like she was trying to vanish into the straw. For a moment, Jed didn't breathe. Then, gently as the wind rustling prairie grass, he stepped closer. "Miss," he said, his voice low but steady. Her eyes fluttered, but she didn't speak. She blinked once, twice, then shrank from him like a cornered animal. The whites of her eyes showed. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said. "Just trying to understand why there's a woman near dead in my barn." Still nothing. Jed dropped to a knee, set the lantern beside her, and took off his coat. The air was cold this early in spring, the kind that scraped bone, and she was trembling so hard her teeth clicked. He draped the coat around her shoulders without touching skin. She flinched anyway. "I'll get you water." He left the lantern. Outside, Eli stood barefoot on the porch with a wooden horse in his hand, carved from cottonwood. 9 years old, silent since his mother died. He tilted his head, watching Jed the way he always did, like the world made more sense through stillness. Jed spoke gently. "There's a woman in the barn." Eli didn't move. "She's hurt." Still nothing. Jed poured water into a tin cup from the pump and brought it back. When he returned, the woman hadn't moved. Just her eyes, following every step like she expected the worst. He crouched again, this time setting the cup beside her. "Name's Jed Holt. This here's my land. Nobody knows you're here but me. You're safe for now, but I'd take comfort in knowing if there's a man I should be watching for." Her lips parted. Her voice was a threat. "No, man. Just you?" A nod. She tried to sit up and failed. Her breath came sharp and quick, pain bubbling just beneath it. Ribs likely cracked. Hands bruised. There was dirt on her knuckles like she'd crawled for miles. He saw the envelope before she covered it with her body. Seal. Water-stained. Addressed to a ranch up north. Not his. Jed didn't press. "I'll boil some broth." By nightfall she had taken 2 sips, curled back under the coat, and fallen into a sleep deeper than reason. Jed stayed near but not close, watching the way the straw clung to her sleeves, like even the barn didn't want to let go of her. Her breath whistled, shallow and uneven. He made a bed of sacks for her that night, hung an old quilt from the rafters to give her something like privacy. Didn't sleep. Just sat on the porch, cleaning a bridle that didn't need cleaning, while Eli curled near the fire with the wood horse in his hands. The boy hadn't spoken in 3 years, but he was listening now. Jed could feel it. "She ain't from here," Jed said softly, though there was no one to answer. "But neither were we once." Wind rustled through the cottonwoods. A nightbird called and was answered. The next morning Jed found the woman trying to stand. She leaned against the barn wall, pale as milk. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the cup of water he'd left. "I'd stop you," he said gently, "but you seem the stubborn kind." She looked up, startled, then eased herself back down. "I'll do no harm," she whispered. "Didn't figure you would." There was a long pause. "Mara," she said finally. "Mara Linwood." He nodded. "You come far?" Her gaze drifted toward the door, then down. Too far for it to matter now. Her voice held a cracked edge, not from illness, but memory. Jed didn't ask more. "You got people?" he asked. Her jaw clenched. "Had a letter. Meant to marry a rancher. That's all. Just a letter." "And him?" "Didn't like how I walked. Or that I'd been married before. I said no when I saw the house. He didn't like that either." Her voice broke. Jed didn't need details. The bruises told most of it. The rest, well, folks out west had long learned that a woman's no was the most dangerous word a man could hear. He tipped his hat. "You'll stay until you don't need to." Mara blinked like she didn't understand the offer. Or didn't believe it. "I've got work," he added, "but I'll leave Eli with you. He don't talk much, but he listens better than most." Days passed. Mara ate little, spoke less. But she stayed. Eli began leaving things by her quilt, a biscuit, an acorn, the wooden horse. Never waiting to see if she took them. Just leaving them there quietly. Jed kept to his rhythm. Fences, horses, chopping wood. But always a second plate now, a second cup on the porch rail. He didn't ask where she went at night, but once he heard her sobbing so quiet it could have been the wind. He said nothing. In town they began to notice. Millie Baird from the boarding house mentioned something about a shadow in Jed Holt's barn. The Reverend asked questions. Jed gave no answers. When Millie pressed, he simply said, "That barn's mine. That land's mine. What ain't mine is anyone else's judgment." But the whispers swirled anyway. That's how it always started. One afternoon Mara tried to help with the laundry. She spilled the water and apologized 3 times. Jed said, "You got nothing to earn here." She looked up sharply. "Then what am I?" He took a long breath. "Someone who's safe." Her mouth trembled. "I don't know what that is." "Well," he said gently, "you're on the land of a man who don't ask for things he ain't given." She nodded but didn't speak again for hours. That night Eli touched her hand for the first time. Just a graze, like a question he didn't know how to form. Mara didn't flinch. She just closed her fingers around his, slowly like it might vanish, and held it there, warm and shaking. And Jed, watching from the shadows of the porch, knew something had shifted. Not healed. Not yet. But something had begun. The wind had a habit of telling on folks. It slipped through the cottonwoods, over the rooftops of sleepy cabins, and whispered secrets down dirt lanes. In a town like Willow Creek, it didn't take much, a flicker at the curtain, a pause in the general store, for something quiet to grow teeth. Jedediah Holt knew that. He'd lived long enough to see how quickly kindness could be twisted into scandal. And now they were talking. The woman in his barn was no longer a mystery. Her name had passed lips like a prayer no one meant to say aloud. Mara Linwood, the mail-order bride who showed up limping, broken, and alone. Word was she'd turned her man down and paid for it. Others said she was no better than a drifter's daughter, looking to bed her way into land. What none of them saw was how she moved slower than a shadow, or how her breath hitched when thunderclouds rolled in. Jed didn't answer questions. He never did. But one morning as he hitched his wagon near Millie Baird's store, he felt the air shift. She stepped onto the porch with arms folded and chin high. "Ain't my place to judge, Jed Holt," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "but women don't just fall into men's barns, less they're looking for something." Jed adjusted his hat and said nothing. He loaded flour and molasses like she hadn't spoken. Behind her, Reverend Crane stood by the well, polishing his spectacles with slow precision. "Scripture says to welcome the stranger," he called across the way. "But it also says to know who lies beneath your roof." Jed gave him the ghost of a nod. "Preacher, I reckon the Lord can sort out my roof in his own good time." Then he turned the wagon and drove off. Back at the ranch, Mara was peeling potatoes by the open window, sunlight softening the harsh lines of her face. She didn't ask what was said in town. She already knew. Her limp had grown more visible as the days wore on, not worse, just real. She no longer tried to hide it. There was a kind of quiet surrender in the way she moved now. She didn't ask to stay. Didn't ask to leave either. She just was. Eli, though, had changed. He followed her from the barn to the porch, never touching, only watching. He would hand her things, an apple, a clean rag, the wooden horse, and she would nod, sometimes smile, never too big, like joy might break if handled too roughly. One night she tried to read to him. Her voice trembled, but she pushed through a page of the adventures of Tom Sawyer until Eli leaned against her arm. His silence was no longer hollow. It was full of listening. "Does he ever speak?" she asked Jed that evening. "Not since she died," Jed replied, voice low. "He screamed when it happened. After that he just stopped." Mara's eyes softened. "That kind of grief," she whispered, "rewrites you." He nodded. "You too." She looked down at her hands. "Me too." It was Sunday when the real shift happened. Jed shaved, wore a clean shirt and hitched the wagon. Mara came to the door, her hair braided tight, the same dress she'd arrived in now stitched with new buttons. She hesitated. "I don't have to come," she said. Jed's hand tightened on the reins. "It's your choice. But folks are gonna talk either way." Mara glanced toward Eli, who stood waiting beside the wagon, his tiny boots dusted from the path. She gave a soft nod. The church sat at the far edge of town like a question nobody wanted to answer. As they stepped inside, heads turned. Pews squeaked. Even the organ faltered before the preacher began his welcome. Mara walked with her chin level. Not proud, just unashamed to exist. They sat in the back. The sermon drifted past her ears, words like forgiveness, virtue, and wayward hearts. Reverend Crane's voice never broke, but his eyes lingered too long on her face. Mara didn't fidget. Didn't look down. But Eli did something no one expected. He stepped forward during the hymn, carrying a single wildflower in his hand. Walked right past the murmuring pews, up to Mara's lap and set it down. Then he turned and walked back. The air in the chapel shifted. A breath held. A few eyebrows lifted. Someone even smiled. Mara didn't cry. But she clutched the flower in her hand like it rooted something in her chest. Later that week, Jed found her in the barn again, standing just barely beside the same spot where he'd found her weeks ago. She reached for the beam to steady herself, whispered, "I wanted to be useful once. Thought marriage was the only way." "You're useful now," he said, arms crossed but voice gentle. "To who?" "To Eli," he said without pause. "To this house." She turned. "And to you." Jed met her eyes. "You already are." Her gaze didn't flinch, but she didn't smile. Instead she said, "Then let me learn." That afternoon he taught her how to hold a bridle. She fumbled, dropped it twice, swore under her breath. He laughed softly. "You're doing just fine." When she fell she didn't cry out. Just sat there, staring at her own hands in the dirt. "I used to be strong," she whispered. "You still are," he said, crouching beside her. "Then why do I feel like the wind could carry me off?" Jed didn't answer. He just brushed the dust from her shoulder and helped her stand. The next few days things shifted again. Mara began walking into town alone, slowly, head bowed but not broken. She bought flour. She left coins exact. She didn't make conversation. But people saw. Some turned away. Others nodded, wary but polite. Millie once murmured, "Poor girl," but didn't finish the thought. The Reverend saw her too. Said nothing. But Mara felt his eyes like a brand. She told Jed that night, "He looked at me like I was a stain on his altar." Jed leaned back in his chair. Crane sees sin in everything but his own reflection. Mara traced the rim of her teacup. He arranged the marriage. To a man who drank until he forgot my name. He was paid to make it happen. Jed didn't ask how she got away. She didn't offer. But later that night, she sat on the porch with Eli beside her and began to hum. Not a song anyone recognized. Just soft notes, fragile, unsure. Eli leaned into her side and closed his eyes. Jed listened from the shadows and thought, maybe the wind doesn't carry everything away. Maybe sometimes it brings things back. The next morning, Mara opened the door to find a pie on the step. No note. Just warm apple and cinnamon. She looked around the yard, empty. Then she smiled, small but certain. Inside, Eli tapped her arm and handed her the wooden horse. She took it and whispered, "Thank you." Eli nodded. Jed watched them from the barn loft, hands still on the hay bale he hadn't lifted yet. And in that quiet moment, he let himself believe that whatever she was healing from, she might just heal here. And maybe, just maybe, so would they. Rain came in soft, persistent waves as though the sky itself couldn't decide whether to weep or whisper. The roof of the ranch house sighed under its weight, and the chimney smoked slow. Mara sat by the window with a shawl around her shoulders, watching the drops trail down the pane like questions she'd never quite answer. Jed was fixing a hinge on the porch door, his shoulders damp but steady, while Eli sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, carving something small from a sliver of pine. The peace between them wasn't loud, but it filled the air like warm bread, solid, quiet, and earned. Until the knock came. A telegram. Delivered in haste. Jed barely glanced at it before his jaw tightened, lips drawing into that line he wore when bad news crept close. He handed it to Mara without a word. She read the words slowly, mouth moving, breath halting. Claim filed. Land dispute initiated by widow's kin. Basis, improper household. Influence of unknown woman. She looked up at him. They mean me. Jed nodded once. They're wrong. They won't care. They'll have to. But she knew how towns worked. Reputation wasn't earned, it was offered by others, and it could be taken away just as easily. The next day, when they rode into town to meet with the magistrate, eyes followed them like shadows. Millie stood on the mercantile porch with her arms crossed, and a younger woman Mara didn't know leaned in close, whispering something that made both of them smirk. Mara didn't drop her gaze. She didn't flinch. Inside the dusty office, a man with spectacles too big for his face peered over a ledger and asked, "Is she your wife, Mr. Holt?" Jed's voice was steady. "She's family." The man didn't write that down. Just underlined something and cleared his throat. When they left, Mara sat rigid in the wagon beside him. The letter tucked into her apron like a bruise. "They want to rip everything from you." Jed stared at the road ahead. "Let him try." She shook her head. "They'll use my past. My limp. My everything. You ain't a weapon, Mara. You're not what they make of you." She didn't answer. But her silence wasn't empty, it roared. Later, as she stood in the mercantile trying to buy sugar and a bolt of cloth, the young clerk, barely 16, refused her coin. "We're out," he said flatly, even as she stared at rows of full sacks behind him. Mara looked around. No one met her eye. Not Millie, not the older man sorting nails, not even the boy who once tipped his cap. "I understand," she said softly, setting the coins on the counter anyway. Then she turned and walked out with her chin level and her hands shaking. Jed was waiting by the wagon. "Did they say something?" "No," she replied. "That's what hurt." On the ride home she didn't speak. Not until they turned past the cottonwood grove, when the sky burned soft orange behind them and the air smelled like wet bark. "I need to leave," she said. Jed pulled the reins. The horses halted. "I'm not good for Eli. Or for you. People won't stop. They want a story to spit and I'm giving them one. You think leaving would fix that?" She looked down at her hands. "It would make it easier for you." He studied her for a long moment. "What happened to you, Mara Linwood?" She didn't answer. So he asked again gently. "What made you think pain was something you owed the world for?" That broke her. Her shoulders folded forward and she wept into her palms, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that raw, shivering way that belonged to women who'd held it too long. "I was 16, she said finally. "Married to a man twice my age. He drank. When he died they said I cursed him. Then came the letters. The offers. I thought, maybe if I played the part they wanted I'd get to stop running." Jed didn't speak. "I never wanted to be rescued," she whispered. "I just wanted to belong somewhere I didn't have to fight to breathe." He reached for her hand. Didn't take it. Just let his fingers rest near hers. Then stopped running. That night she packed anyway. Jed found her at dawn, near the corral, clutching a bundle wrapped in one of his old shirts. "I won't make trouble," she said quickly. He looked at her for a long moment, then walked past her, picked up the bundle, and turned toward the house. "You coming?" he asked. She stood still. "Because breakfast ain't worth a damn cold." And with that he walked away. She followed. Eli was waiting with a cup of tea. Mara took it, her fingers trembling, and tried to smile. He didn't hand her the wooden horse this time. Instead, he took her shawl and draped it around her shoulders, clumsy but thoughtful. She touched his hair just once and said, "You remind me of someone I lost." Eli looked up, eyes wide. "I think she's here," Mara added, in the quiet. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small object, newly carved, barely shaped, but it looked like a woman sitting with a child in her lap. She held it like it was fragile bone. That night she sang again, louder this time. The same melody from before, but now it filled the barn like smoke, warm and clinging. Jed stood at the door, hat in hand, watching the light flicker through the cracks. "She's not going anywhere," he whispered. But he also knew what the town gave it could still take. And soon, they would have to decide whether to bow to its judgment or plant their heels against it. Because the shame they gave her wasn't hers to carry. But if they didn't take it back, she'd carry it anyway. And he would not let that happen. The drought came quiet at first. A week with no rain. Then two. Then the creek thinned to a trickle and the wind picked up its old habits, blowing dust through the porch slats, lifting skirts and tempers alike. Cattle grew restless. Fields crackled beneath the sun. Every prayer left on a church pew tasted like desperation. Jed Holt watched the sky like a man waiting for a letter that never came. His crops, modest though they were, began to wilt around the edges. The soil cracked. The hens laid fewer eggs. Even the dog down the road had stopped barking, as if the land had pressed a finger to its lips. But the house remained quiet, steady. Inside, Mara Linwood folded linens, helped Eli write the alphabet in the dust with a stick, and brewed tea from dried herbs no one in town asked the name of. She spoke little still, but when she did, the words came softer now, less like apologies and more like intentions. The shame had not vanished. But it no longer sat in her lap. It stood a few feet away, pacing in frustration, waiting to be fed again, and she had stopped feeding it. One morning, Jed handed her the reins. "Come with me," he said. She blinked. "To town?" He nodded. If they're going to talk, they might as well have something to talk about. So she rode beside him, her dress sun-bleached and faded but clean. Her hair was braided with a thin blue ribbon, one Eli had placed beside her cup that morning. No one said a word as they passed, but doors didn't swing as wide and curtains moved just a little more than the wind allowed. At the market she bought what they needed, flour, salt, oil. And when a child dropped his basket of apples, she bent to help him gather them. His mother, seeing Mara's limp, rushed over, snatched the boy away without a thank you. Mara stood slowly, smiled anyhow. "I can't undo what they believe," she said quietly to Jed as they loaded the wagon. "But I can stop believing it myself." He watched her then, not just her movements but the stillness beneath them. That's more than most ever learn. That evening the air smelled strange, like ash wrapped in silk. Mara was brushing Eli's hair on the porch when the first shout came. Fire. They stood together, turned toward the town. Thick smoke climbed past the ridge. It was the boarding house. Jed dropped the bucket he just filled and ran. Mara stood frozen for half a breath, then followed. By the time they reached town, half the men were forming a crude line from the well to the back wall of the house. Women shouted, children cried. Millie Baird stood in the road, screaming her son's name. "Jacob. He's still inside." No one moved. Mara stepped forward. "Someone stop her." Millie shrieked. But no one did. She pulled her shawl up over her nose, took one breath and disappeared through the smoke. Jed charged forward, but Reverend Crane blocked his path. "Let her make her own salvation," the man said, smug as stone. Jed shoved him aside and followed. Inside was heat and shadow and splinters of flame. "Mara," he called, coughing. Through the haze he saw her, a silhouette bent over a boy no older than Eli, dragging him toward the light. Then the roof groaned. He reached them just as a beam cracked overhead. Threw his arm around both and pulled. The fire kissed his coat but spared his skin. They stumbled out together. The crowd parted. Mara's hair was singed, her dress blackened. Her palms blistered. But she held the child like he was hers. Millie wept. "You saved him," she whispered. "You." But Mara didn't answer. She sank to the ground, clutching her ribs and looked toward Jed. Didn't run this time, she murmured. No, he said, crouching beside her. You stood. A woman fetched water. Another brought bandages. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders. No one called her wicked. No one turned away. And that night, when Eli stepped onto the porch and placed the wooden carving in her lap, a new one shaped like a flame, he finally spoke. Ma. One word. A whisper. Mara's hands flew to her mouth. She shook her head, trembling. Jed turned, stunned. Eli looked up and said it again, clearer. Ma. Mara pulled him close, her burned hands cradling his small frame, tears rolling freely now. And Jed knew without saying it that something had changed. Not just in the boy. Not just in her. But in the town too. Fire had come. And water had followed. The rains came 1 week after the fire. Not a drizzle, but a soaking, generous storm that poured over the land like forgiveness itself. It fell in sheets, washing the soot from rooftops, loosening the stubborn dust from the folds of blankets, and softening the soil that had hardened with silence and suspicion. By morning the creek ran again. By the third day, the first shoots of green had pushed through the blackened field behind Jed Holt's barn. He didn't speak of it, not out loud. But every morning, he stood beside that sprouting field with his hat pressed to his chest, as if giving thanks not just for rain, but for what had endured. Inside the house, Mara moved carefully, her bandaged hands stiff and tender. Yet she never asked for help. She cooked, cleaned, mended what she could. The pain was part of her now, folded into her fingers like seams in old cloth. She'd been through worse. Fire couldn't take what shame already hadn't. But something had shifted. The way the townsfolk paused before speaking to her. The way Millie Baird came by once a week now with preserves she never asked for. The way a boy at the well offered to carry her bucket without smirking. She didn't believe in redemption. But perhaps in recognition. That she could hold on to. The land dispute came to trial the following week. Jed wore the same coat he'd worn the day he buried his wife. Mara wore the patched blue dress with the scorched hemline. They walked in together, no arm-in-arm ceremony, just side by side like people who'd earned each other. The judge was an old man with cracked knuckles and a war medal pinned to his vest. He read the claim, looked at the signatures, and then asked Jed one question. Is this woman your wife? Jed didn't blink. Not by law. Not by paper. But she's raised my boy, stood through fire, and carried more dignity in silence than most do in speeches. The judge looked at Mara. You willing to speak for yourself, miss? Mara stood. Her voice didn't tremble. I was bought once. Sent like freight. I won't be that again. I don't carry his name, but I carry his home. And I don't want his land. Just the right to stay on it. The judge leaned back. That'll do. Later, when the ruling came, it was written plain. The Holt land would remain undivided. The court saw no moral or legal reason to remove Mara Linwood from the household. The challenge was dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Reverend Crane stared at them from the edge of the boardwalk. But his glare held no teeth now. Only fear of his own fading relevance. He stepped back into the shadows without a word. They rode home in silence, the wind gentle, the sun warm on their shoulders. A few days later, Jed stood in the field at dusk. Mara came to him, her hands clean, the scent of fresh bread still clinging to her. Eli trailed behind, barefoot, with a bundle of wildflowers tied with twine. The harvest came early, Jed said softly, nodding to the field. She followed his gaze. And without promise. He looked at her then, full on. I didn't ask you to stay. No, she said. You let me choose. Eli stepped between them, holding out the flowers. For Ma. She took them, knelt down, kissed his hair. For us, she whispered. That Sunday she entered the church alone. Walked past every pew, her gait uneven but proud, and took a seat near the front. She wore no hat to hide her face, no gloves to cover her hands. She met each stare with calm certainty. No one turned away. Not even Reverend Crane, who nodded once in her direction and continued his sermon with a quiver in his throat. Afterward, on the front steps, Jed approached with Eli in tow. He didn't speak right away. Just stood beside her, close but without presumption. Then he bent a knee, not with a ring but with a plain silver hairpin in his hand. To hold back what falls, he said, and stay if you will. Mara reached out, took the pin and fastened it into her braid. No one clapped. No one cheered. But something unspoken passed through the crowd. A recognition. A reckoning. That evening they didn't hold a wedding. They held a supper. The barn doors were thrown open, tables lined with cornbread and stew and peach cobbler. The whole town came, some with curious glances, others with silent gratitude. Children danced. Old men played fiddle. Women sat with their hands clasped in laps, remembering things they'd buried years ago. Mara moved through it like she belonged there because now she did. Not by papers or promises, but by presence. By fire and water. By the soft miracle of staying. Later, long after the last lantern had gone out, she stood at the edge of the field and watched the wind ripple the new growth like a song too shy to finish itself. Jed came to stand beside her. "You ever think it'd be like this?" he asked. "I didn't think I'd still be alive," she said. He nodded. "Then I reckon we're both living something better than we planned." They stood without touching, but the air between them was full of all that had been earned and not said. Sometimes, love didn't arrive with trumpets or lace. Sometimes it walked through the back door, burned and blistered, and stayed through the storms. And when it did, when it really did, something holy grew. Not loud, but true. And if you're ever out near Holt Land come spring, they say the harvest is always richer than expected. Not because of rain. Not because of soil. But because someone stayed when no one else would. Because sometimes the life you're meant to live waits just past the fire, quiet, steady, and wild with grace.